Hi everybody, this is Dr. Seymour. Sorry I can't be with you this week, or technically next week since I'm recording this on Friday. But basically this is a quick and informal introduction to queer theory. I'm going to be drawing on a big stack of notes that I have here, so please forgive me as I ruffle through those. So queer theory emerges in the late 80s and early 1990s, mostly in the US. And it's a kind of school of thought that's very much inspired by and informed by a lot of the activism that was going on around those times, especially around AIDS. So you had groups like Queer Nation, ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power that's an acronym for that. So organizations that were not, apologetic and were not asking for inclusion, but rather asking for revolution. They were groups that were radical rather than liberal, so left of liberal. And queer theory sort of emerges through that on the street activism, but it emerges in universities, again, starting in the early 1990s, where queer theorists start to be very suspicious of requests for inclusion, as we said before. They're suspicious of the system of liberalism. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And suspicious of discourses of personal freedom or visibility as being the things that activists should be striving for. A lot of these people, a lot of these queer theorists, like Michael Warner, who you're going to read, were interested in the idea of the social construction of gender and sexuality, and also about what gets counted as normal or natural. So they're suspicious of those categories as well. And kind of the moves that queer theorists tend to make, I'll just list out a couple of these moves. One, especially in queer literary theory, is this kind of suspicious way of reading text. So I call this the lady doth protest too much way of reading text. So a lot of queer theorists were looking at literature in this very, again, kind of critical and suspicious way and saying things like, this text appears to be a straight story on the surface, but actually if we look a little further, there's some kind of queer moments in it. Queer theorists also like to do this move that I call, you think it's like this, but really it's like that. So it's the counterintuitive kind of move. And you see that with the Nair piece, actually with the Warner piece as well. So, gay marriage or same-sex marriage sounds good, right? Aren't we all progressive people here? But they say, actually, it's bad. And then they're going to explain why. So overall, they're very, queer theorists are very controversial. They're very contrarian. Sometimes they get criticized or get in trouble for sounding an awful lot like conservatives. So on the one hand, you have conservatives saying same-sex marriage is bad, and then you have these queer theorists saying same-sex marriage is bad, and they look a lot alike, right? But when you actually do the reading, when you read the Warner, when you read the Nair, you understand their political stance. So they're opposing same-sex marriage for very different reasons than conservatives are. And again, this is something that comes out of the late 80s and early 90s. It continues way past that, as we're going to see. But just to make a little bit more historical sense of this, the same-sex marriage debates and obviously the legalization of same-sex marriage starts around that time. So that's why you get a lot of stuff, a lot of queer theory about this fight for marriage and specifically criticizing this fight for marriage. So if we think back to, I think the very first day of class, we talked about this kind of phrase, which is not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck you. So again, queer theorists are very critical, they're very contrarian, very radical. So that's kind of their attitude. And what I did in the announcement that you're going to see shortly is try to come up with a schema to sort of think about what queer theory is or does and believes in, as opposed to what it doesn't do and what it doesn't believe in. So again, queer theory is calling for revolution as opposed to inclusion. Queer theory is radical as opposed to liberal. And again, I'm going to say more about what we mean by liberal. And it also believes in constructionism versus a pre-given order. And it believes in historical contingency versus transhistoricity. And I'm going to pause on that one for a second. So queer theorists don't like to do things like saying things like trans people have always existed throughout time. they would say, maybe, kind of, but it's more complicated than that. So they're interested, like we talked about this person Foucault a while ago, they're interested in this idea of saying, yes, but what trans means at a particular time is socially constructed, right? There might be societies such as indigenous Native American societies that have always supported trans people, for example, and others like white societies, settler societies that have not, right? So they're all about sort of thinking about the context and the history rather than sort of saying like, oh, everything's been the same throughout time. Let's see. Queer theorists like to question the notion of progress. So they might say, as you kind of see Nair say, okay, so we get things like same-sex marriage, but how come we have such a horrible record in the United States on immigration, right? How far have we really come? They're very suspicious of this idea that we've come very far. And so related to that, they're very, cynical, pessimistic even, and critical, as opposed to being celebratory or positive or reclaiming or whatever. At the same time, a lot of queer theory writing is very playful. It's very ironic, as opposed to being serious and straightforward. So a lot of queer theorists, as I think we'll see with Luby, we'll see this with Saracen, we'll see it with a lot of the upcoming readings, they are making their critiques in pretty playful, kind of striking ways. So, and let's see, one last one here, or two more. As I was saying before, queer theory is anti-assimilationist rather than assimilationist. So rather than saying, as a queer person, let me into your structure, they want to say change the whole structure, right? And I should add one more thing about the background history of queer theory that I don't think I said, which is that it really is attached to critiques of neoliberalism that start emerging in, again, the late 80s and early 90s. And this is going to sound a little confusing at first. So let me back up for a second and say neoliberalism is a term that refers to a set of economic as well as social policies that come out in the late 80s and early 90s. And so let me just summarize some of those policies here. So things like the rule of the market, free enterprise, cutting public expenditure for social services, deregulation, privatization. So things like if you think about, we have for-profit prisons in the United States, for example. The U.S. Postal Service is undergoing a very interesting situation right now, where it seems like there are efforts to try to privatize it to make it a private business, right, rather than a public good. So things like that are happening, and in general, sort of this elimination of the concept of the public good or community and replacing it with individual responsibility. And I should say that I'm drawing from an article on a website called Corp Watch here. So they're not fans of corporations. So you can take these definitions with a grain of salt, but economists and historians agree that what we've had over the past 30 years is a system called neoliberalism. So neoliberalism doesn't necessarily mean liberal as in leftist or progressive. It simply refers to this idea of the markets being more free, right? So free enterprise, lack of regulation, privatization. So that's a liberal economic philosophy. It's not necessarily a social economic philosophy. And in fact, some people would say it's rather conservative. What does this have to do with sex? What does this have to do with sexuality? What does it have to do with gender? What does it have to do with queer theory? Well, a lot of these queer theorists, and you see this kind of in the background of Warner, you see this in the background of Nair. She actually uses the term neoliberalism. So these are people that kind of watched all these changes happen, and they were getting very concerned. So Nair, in particular, she says, marriage is part of a larger neoliberal enterprise, a greater system of privatization, a state of things where people increasingly must enter into private contracts like marriage in order to gain the most basic benefits, like healthcare, immigration, etc., right? And so these theorists were starting to see how these economic policies and these policies around, again, things like immigration, they were being tied to private things like marriage and sexuality, right? So the argument here is that the expansion of marriage to include LGBTQ people is not actually progressive. It's regressive insofar as we're still tying things like healthcare, access to healthcare, access to immigration status to these private situations. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, this can be one of the questions you ask on the discussion board. So I'm just going to say a couple things about Warner and a couple things about Nair and wrap this up here. So Warner's really interesting because he is one of the people who came up with the term heteronormativity, which you've probably heard at some point. So basically a way of looking at the world that sort of assumes heterosexuality is normal, penalizes those who are not. It's not quite the same as homophobia. It's more about sort of assuming heterosexuality as the norm, right? And that term, heteronormativity, actually becomes the basis for homonormativity, which is actually what he's interested in, what he's talking about with this, with his piece, right? LGBTQ people wanting to assimilate, to use that term I used before, to be normal, right? And he tries to show us that, normal has no meaning. It is socially constructed. Although I think we should differentiate here between normal and normativity. So there are things that might be common, so heterosexuality is more common than homosexuality as far as we know. But there's a large leap between simply noticing whether something is common or statistically frequent and actually constructing a system that privileges that thing over other things, right? And that's what he's writing about. And then Nair, again, is really interested in these economic issues that people have sort of, including LGBTQ people, they've sort of swept them under the rug, right? So if you see these, if you saw the posters around the same-sex marriage debates, you'd see things like, this is about love, love is love, right? And Nair's like, is it about love? Or is it about economics? And is it about, anti-immigration? Is it about all these, refusal to provide universal health care, et cetera? Okay, so, and then I'll just add one more thing, actually two more things. If you read the comments under Nair's article, they say never read the comments, but there's actually some really great comments there that I think are really helpful. And so one person says, some advocates of same-sex marriage want to keep the stigma, that is the stigma of not being married, alive, not what I'd call progressive. So again, trying to show that LGBTQ activism isn't always radical. Sometimes it's just trying to fit in, trying to be like everyone else. And then the same commenter says, marriage isn't about equality. First and foremost, it's about establishing and managing inequality between some couples and others. And so I think that's a really helpful statement to think about queer theory as a whole. That's what queer theory has been interested in for quite some time, is how every normalization creates an other, like capital O, right? So if we make same-sex marriage the norm, then what falls out of the norm is people who are not married, not just queer people, but just people who are not married, right? So queer theory is interested in how norms get produced and how norms themselves produce others, people that don't fit in. Okay, this was a way longer than I wanted to make it. Hopefully you've survived, and I will see you when I return on November 1st. Bye.